Chapter 3722. Yulin smiled. All right, good girl. I have to deal with official business. Didn't you say that your biggest official business is me? She put what she had learned into practice. He was stunned for a moment before he smiled. You're different after marrying me. You've become smarter. She glared at him. I'm not married yet. Yulin coughed lightly. Actually, Shueli, you don't have to propose to me 3 times a day. She was furious. Lying on his shoulder, she purposely bit his neck and even sucked out a hickey. He let her be, but warned her, I have a meeting later. As he spoke, he caressed her red lips with a slight smile in his eyes. Many people saw you coming today. Her eyes widened. Yulin, you're so bad. You tricked me. I didn't seduce you to bite me. He smiled and rolled the documents into a cylinder. Play by yourself. I'm going to the meeting. She was anxious. She grabbed his arm and stammered. Hey, you're going to the meeting like this? He raised his eyebrows slightly. What else? She reached out and pulled his collar up a little. At least block it a little. His gaze was unfathomable, and there was a smile on his lips. You can be shy too? She stared at him with watery eyes. He smiled and entered the restroom. He tidied himself up in front of the mirror and turned his head. Is this okay? Bai Shueli nodded. He lowered his body slightly. She played dumb. What are you doing? I'm going to the meeting soon. Bai Shueli, hurry up. In the end, she went over and kissed him. She murmured, Yulin, I'll wait for you here. A trace of warmth flashed through his eyes, but seemed to be even hotter. However, he didn't do anything. He only reached out to pinch her face and left. After he left, Bai Shueli played games alone in his office for about 2 to 3 hours. He didn't come back for lunch. Instead, Secretary Li came back with a special lunchbox for her. Bai Shueli sat there. Where's he? Secretary Li held back his laughter. Which him? Yulin, Bai Shueli complained as she ate. Secretary Li, you've been with him for too long. You've been corrupted. Secretary Li sighed and sat down to eat with her. Then, she said, I'm going to a meeting in a while. The bureau chief is very busy and hasn't eaten yet. Those who are in the meeting with me are being fucked. If I don't accompany you, I'll be in trouble too. There was a hint of worry in Bai Shueli's eyes. Is he fierce? There are so many official duties, and the subordinates are always messing around. The chief is always angry. It's not easy to work under him, but there is a future. Secretary Li smiled. He treats you differently. If you see him scolding his female subordinates, you will definitely be scared to tears. He scolded his female subordinates. Bai Shueli bit her lips. I thought his temper had changed a long time ago. Secretary Li could be considered an old employee of Yulin's. He smiled. What changed? What the fuck did he change? He's still as heartless as ever. It's just because he likes you that he tolerates and loves you. Other people don't have such a good life. Secretary Li came over and whispered. In this building, there are many women who throw themselves at the bureau chief. There are 4 or 5 of them openly, but they're all quite embarrassing. The whole building knows that the bureau chief doesn't like them. End of this chapter. Chapter 3723. The Gift of Love Translator. Henyi Translations Editor. Henyi Translations. You're not transferring them away? Bai Shueli frowned. Secretary Li sighed softly. How can it be so easy? They're all relatives of the emperor, and they're closely related to each other. It's not good to offend them for such a thing. So, the bureau chief decided to treat them badly and have strict work requirements. But even so, there's still a few women who want to be promoted. They're trying their best to get ahead. Bai Shueli thought about it and felt that it was dangerous for her man to work here. But she couldn't say anything and could only eat quietly. After a while, she said, He doesn't eat lunch? Sigh. That's how the bureau chief got his stomach disease. Secretary Li brought up the past again. All right, Shueli, you have to remember what I said just now. Men have to be fed at home. He won't go out and cause trouble. Secretary Li winked and said, You know what I mean. Bai Shueli looked down. I don't know. I only care about whether he eats or not. Then, she put down her chopsticks. Can't he spare time for lunch? Even 10 minutes would be good. That's how it is when he's busy. Sometimes he has meetings from morning to night. Secretary Lee exaggerated. Why don't you go and ask the bureau chief to eat? It's not good for me to go. Bai Shuali buried her face and looked at Secretary Lee. Are you trying to frame me? Secretary Lee swore. I definitely didn't mean that. I'm also worried about the bureau chief. But he won't listen to me. Shuali, he will listen to you if you persuade him. Bai Shuali's expression was a little worried. Secretary Lee added, think about it. The bureau chief's health is your sexual happiness. You're talking nonsense again. Bai Shuali bit her lip. Then I'll go and ask him. I can't do anything if he doesn't listen. Secretary Lee looked at her and laughed. Shuali, why are you so arrogant? She stared at Secretary Lee. This isn't my home. What can I do? There are so many people here. Secretary Lee blinked. The bureau chief won't be angry with you. She brought Bai Shuali to the door of the conference room, and Secretary Lee opened the door a little. Oh my! The bureau chief was scolding someone, and the person he was scolding happened to be the one who seduced Imulin in the past. Imulin didn't give him any face and scolded him until he had no face left. At this moment, Secretary Lee opened the door. Imulin's voice still had some lingering anger. What's the matter? Secretary Lee smiled. Sir, Shirley is looking for you. Imulin's expression changed in an instant. His voice became much gentler, and he had no intention of avoiding the topic. Where is she? Secretary Lee pushed Bai Shuali out. The door opened, and Bai Shuali looked at the people in the conference room. There were dozens of them, and some of them looked like they wanted to eat her alive. Humph! She wasn't afraid. Who was she afraid of? When Imulin returned home, he would have to be subservient to her. Why would she care about these women? So she coughed lightly. I can't eat alone. You have to accompany me. Then, he added, it's not working hours right now. In the huge conference room, there was only silence. Everyone was looking at Bai Shuali. Based on the bureau chief's temper, he would definitely blow her up. That was because bureau chief he liked people who couldn't distinguish between work and work. Wasn't it the same for favored women? Unexpectedly, Imulin stared at Bai Shuali and closed the document. Meeting adjourned. We'll continue at 2 in the afternoon. Chapter 3724. After Imulin finished speaking, the meeting room was silent. No one dared to believe that the workaholic General Yi would say such words. In the past, when General Yi was angry, he wouldn't even be able to drink water, much less eat. But now, General Yi had changed, hadn't he? Under those gazes, Imulin got up and walked to the door. He gently knocked the document in his hand on Bai Shuali's head. Bai Shuali looked up at him, and he smiled. Didn't you say that you won't be able to eat if I don't accompany you? Aren't you going to leave? She replied with an "oh" and followed behind him obediently. After feeling a few unfriendly gazes, she hugged his arm and declared her sovereignty. Imulin let her hug him, and then he reached out and hugged her in his arms. Fuck, what a great doting this is. Was General Yi going to give up his country for his beauty? If this matter was exposed, it would become a stain on his reputation, and he didn't know what would happen in the future. But Imulin didn't care at all. He hugged his wife and went to eat. In the office, he was still looking at the document, his brows furrowed. Bai Shuali scooped a spoonful of rice. Eat. He looked up and frowned. Just let me eat this. Who asked you to be so disobedient? She plucked the document from his hand. Eating is eating. These things can't be finished. Imulin put down the document and said, if they all let me be less worried, I wouldn't need to take up the mealtime. Then you should punish them. Hit a dick, hit it hard. She was trying to make him happy, so she said that. Imulin looked at her and chuckled. Like hitting you? How can that be the same? She was anxious, her face a little red. He laughed. Yes, there's a difference. I can't strip them of their clothes and beat their butts. Don't you think so? She glared at him angrily. Imulin smiled and reached out to rub her little head. All right, eat well. Take a break at noon before the meeting. She replied with an and hugged him. After a while, he looked at her. Let's eat. How am I going to eat if you're so clingy? I just want a hug. She pursed her lips. I don't like the way those women look at you. He was angry and amused at the same time. He reached out and patted her. You're thinking too much. Bai Shuali bit her lips, reached out to hug him, and accompanied him to eat. She was also very clingy. After a while, he asked calmly, How did Secretary Lee lure you over? Ah, only then did she realize that she had been tricked by Secretary Lee. Then she said angrily, she said a woman seduced you. So you fell for it? As he ate, he glanced at her. By Shiwali, you're really something. Next time you go out, don't tell others that you're my wife. If you don't want to say it, then don't say it. Do you think you're old? Then, she stuck out her tongue. All right, Yimulin, you have to eat properly. Your body is my happiness. He was pleased by her. Other people might not like her idiotic look, but he liked it very much. Actually, he knew that she could be independent a long time ago. The reason why she was like this was because she knew what he liked. She just wanted to make him happy. Yimulin suddenly reached out and patted her little head. Shweli, have I ever said that I love you? But I feel that you love my body more. She complained to him. His gaze was clear as he chuckled. You're right, actually. Chapter 37:25. It took a while for Bai Shiwali to come back to her senses and stare at him. Yimulin chuckled and pinched her face. Silly egg. I'm not a silly egg, she snorted, but she still reached out and hugged his arm, leaning against him. Silly egg was silly egg. Yimulin smiled. At this moment, Bai Shiwali probably thought that he was the one who gave her happiness, but that wasn't the case. It was she who gave him happiness. In the past, in Yimullin's life, it was fine as long as he had a career. His wife and children were secondary and dispensable. However, when he confirmed that Bai Shiwali was the other half of his life, she became more important than anything else. He could even give up his career as a lawyer. Silly Egg definitely didn't know how much energy she had. This energy gave him a very happy feeling. He loved her very much, and he loved her more and more every day. However, he wouldn't say these words. A man's love was all done through acting. Yimulin smiled and patted his little wife's head. All right, rest for a while. There's a meeting in the afternoon. Then, he complained, there's really no end to it. This was a man's little trick. Only a sweet and naive girl like Bai Shiwali would believe it. How scary was it? She had only been back for a short while, and the independent image of a woman she had painstakingly built up was completely destroyed. In an instant, she had become his worm again, and she was even more obedient and well-behaved. However, he doted on her even more. His little complaint immediately made her nervous. She asked, "Are you very tired?" He grunted and went to the bed in the lounge to lie down and close his eyes. His little worm immediately lay in his arms, making it convenient for him to hug her. Seeing that he didn't hug her, she quickly knelt beside him and carefully massaged his forehead, as if she was serving a master. Yimulin found it funny, but he held it in. If he laughed, she probably wouldn't fall for his tricks again. It was clearly a prank, but her little hand was really comfortable, and he actually fell asleep just like that. When he woke up, it was already an hour later. He opened his eyes and saw his little worm still kneeling beside him, gently massaging his forehead. He was touched and a little distressed. He reached out and took her hand. His voice was gentle. "I was just joking with you. Why did you take it so seriously?" His voice was husky and sexy. "Oh," she replied, then snuggled into his embrace and whispered, "I just want you to feel better." He looked at her with a clear gaze. Then, she realized that he had misunderstood. She blushed and hugged him. "Don't talk nonsense." Yimulin chuckled for a while and got up reluctantly. He pressed her down and said, "Take a nap. I'll wake you up after work." She felt sorry for him, but she also felt sorry for herself. She had been massaging him for so long that her hands were sore. Thus, he fell asleep peacefully and slept until 6 o'clock in the afternoon. And in these 4 hours, Nocturnal Chieftain made his subordinates miserable. They thought that Nocturnal Chieftain was like a spring breeze, but it wasn't. Without Bai Shiwali, Nocturnal Chieftain was still that strict Black Lord Bao. When Yimulin returned to his office, the rice worm was still asleep. He stood by the bed and thought silently that she had probably forgotten that Anin was at his mother's place. She had been taking care of Anin for the past few years. He thought that she had grown up, but when she returned to his side, she was still a child. It was infuriating and funny at the same time. However, it was good for her to be by his side. End of chapter. Chapter 37:26. He stood by the bed, leaned over, and blew into her ear. Lazybones, get up. When she woke up, her eyes were misty. Hugging her pillow, she complained, so tired. He bent down to look at her. There was still a faint blue hue under her eyes. She probably hadn't slept well for the past few days. Mr. Yi checks himself and feels that he has overused her recently, so he smiles and kisses her eyelids. I'll let you go tonight. There was a hint of fear in Bai Shuali's eyes. What else did you want? What do you think? He smiled and pulled her up, fixing her clothes and hair. Go somewhere with me. She looked at him blankly. Yulin only smiled faintly. You like it? Oh, she said as he brought her to the car. As she fastened her seatbelt, she said worriedly, do you think people will think that I'm your mistress? He glanced at her and deliberately said slowly, I think so. Bai Shuali glanced at him. You're a bad person. He chuckled delightedly. Then you're a bad woman. His eyes were filled with satisfaction because bullying her was his greatest pleasure. Bai Shuali didn't say anything to him. She couldn't beat him in an argument anyway. He was driving, so she didn't disturb him. She played by herself. The quiet space was filled with a sweet scent. She didn't speak until he drove the car into the parking lot of the building. Surprised, she asked, This isn't a place to eat. Yulin unfastened his seatbelt, looked at her, and smiled gently. This is where you eat. Ah. She stared at him and made a gesture of chewing something. I'm chewing cement? Little idiot. He looked at her and smiled. Then he opened the car door. Get out, Bai. President. President Bai? Bai Shuali looked at him suspiciously and got out of the car as well. He extended his hand towards her. When she placed it in his palm, he reached out and held it. He brought her to the elevator and said, This building is the headquarters of Jia He Publishing. I'm buying it. It's for you. Send me off? Bai Shuali realized something and stopped in her tracks. She glared at him. Jia? The publishing house I work for? You don't even know where you eat. He put on the attitude of a superior, but his eyes looked more like he was looking at a little idiot. Bai Shuali looked at him blankly. After a long time, she slowly said, But buying Jia He costs a lot of money, right? Yulin's eyes were somewhat clear. A few billion. It's not a lot. She stammered. But why did you buy it? What do you think? He wasn't in a hurry to go up. Instead, he held her waist with one hand and smiled slightly. Bai Shuali bit her lips. How would I know? He leaned forward, lowered his head, and bit her lips. His voice was a little low. Bai Shuali, if you continue to play dumb, believe it or not, I'll talk. She shrieked at once, afraid he would do something rash. He waited with a proud expression. Bai Shuali's little face was red. After a long time, she said softly, It's because I'm happy. No. He reached out his index finger to touch her lips and said suggestively, It's for my own happiness. Chapter 37:27. She blushed and stammered. Yulin, you won't ask me to do anything just because of this small favor. You're not such a petty person, are you? His voice was soft and slow. Coincidentally, I think this favor is not small. She stared at him with watery eyes for a long time and then held his hand. Oh, he turned to look at her as he walked. So, you mean you agree? Then, she reached out and hugged his arm. She placed her face on his arm and said softly, Yulin, how did you think of buying this for me? He replied, Because I want to make you happy. You're so nice. She rubbed her face against his arm. Hubby is so nice. Wake up. We haven't registered our marriage yet. He smiled and pinched her face. Miss Bai, are you proposing to me again? She was furious again. Yulin, you're so bad. If I'm bad, then you won't want to marry me anymore? That's good too. He teased her. Bai Shuali hugged him and didn't let go. She acted coquettishly, which was very beautiful. This building was all owned by Jia He Publishing. She followed him in and went straight to the first floor. The executives of the publishing company were all working on this floor, including the conference room. The elevator door opened. Yulin's financial manager, Ben, was already waiting for them. He smiled when he saw them. Mr. Yi, Mrs. Yi. To Ben, Yulin was his biggest client, not the bureau chief. Yulin nodded at him, but his expression was serious. Is everyone in the conference room? Bai Shuali saw his expression. It reminded her of when he was a lawyer back then. She missed it, so she couldn't help but look at him for a while. Yulin turned around and saw her mesmerized expression. He adjusted his expression. President Bai, you can look at him slowly when we get home. Don't drool at a man in front of your subordinates now. Okay? She blushed and glared at him. Yulin smiled and walked into the conference room with Ben. Bai Shiwili followed behind him, but he pressed her gently to Ben's side. Yulin did not participate. He was more like a bystander. In the meeting room, everyone was a veteran of Jia. Of course, the awesome George was also sitting there, and his new favorite, Serena, was sitting beside him. When they saw Bai Shiwili, George was shocked, and Serena couldn't sit still. She and Bai Shiwili were the two most popular translators in Jiahe. She had always wanted to suppress Bai Shiwili, so she and George had worked together, using George's hand to suppress Bai Shiwili. But what was the situation now? George blurted out, "What's going on?" Ben stepped forward and took out a document with a smile. Mr. Li Jiahe of this publishing house has transferred 100% of Jiahe's shares to Mr. Yi, and Mr. Yi has given it to Miss Bai Shiwili. In other words, Miss Bai is now the owner and operator of this publishing house. Bai Shiwili tilted her head and looked at Yulin. What if I don't know how to run the company and cause it to collapse? If you fall, go home and give birth. Yulin chuckled. Bai Shiwili clenched her fists. I won't collapse it. Oh, let's wait and see. He chuckled. Then, she felt that he was a pervert. He spent billions just to see her collapse it. Chapter 37-28 Gift of Love 12. After Ben finished his announcement, George was the first to disagree. That's impossible. Mr. Li would never sell Jiahe. This document must be fake. Ben smiled. I didn't sell it before because I wasn't satisfied with the price and the temptation wasn't strong enough. This time, Mr. Yi has increased the price by 30%. He has no reason not to sell it. 30%? George's eyes were bloodshot. Why? Ben shrugged his shoulders. Probably because he wants to make Miss Bai happy. He turned his head and looked at Bai Shiwili. President Bai, say a few words. Bai Shiwili expressed that she did not know how to be a president, but since she was asked to speak, she would speak the truth. She adjusted her emotions and coughed lightly. Everyone, you have to work hard. You have to put in more effort than before, because I don't know how to run a business. If you don't want to lose your job, you have to work hard to keep the publishing house. Then she looked down. The people below were also at a loss. Was that it? Then they cursed in their hearts. Shouldn't the boss think of a solution? Why did he let them think of a solution? They wanted to cry. It was the first time they had such a capricious boss. Bai Shiwili silently cheered them on in her heart. Just because I don't want to go home to give birth, you guys want to rush. However, as the saying goes, a newly appointed official makes a clean sweep. She still announced that George was fired. This decision was very satisfying. Serena looked at George before shifting her gaze to Yulin. She didn't feel any sympathy for George as he was just making use of their relationship. She was more interested in the man beside Bai Shiwili. He bought Jiahe with a large sum of money without batting an eyelid, just to make the woman smile. Unlike George, Serena didn't let her anger get to her head. At this moment, she realized that the man in front of her was very familiar. Then she recalled, God, it was Yulin. That unreachable man had actually appeared here and spent a fortune for a woman. Therefore, when Yulin was about to leave with Bai Shiwili, Serena chased after them and apologized to Bai Shiwili sincerely. Shiwili, I really didn't know that George would be so despicable. I've drawn a clear line between us. Besides, if you want to, you can still translate that book. Bai Shiwili was a little confused. You broke up? Didn't you say that you would never leave me? Serena's eyes flashed with impatience. This little idiot. She squeezed out a beautiful smile. I feel uneasy because of George. Why don't I treat you to dinner? From the beginning to the end, Yulin remained indifferent and let Bai Shiwili send people away. However, it was obvious that his family's rice worm was not on the same level as this Miss Serena. He suddenly realized that what he liked was actually her simplicity. Whether she liked or disliked him, she was very straightforward. She used the clumsiest method to chase after Mubai. She did not even try to hide her feelings for him, and was even better at using others. She was who she was, his worm. Nocturnal chieftain suddenly felt blissful again. He coughed lightly. "I'm hungry." Bai Shuili was stunned. She looked at him and then at Serena. "You mean, let's have dinner together?" He looked at her with a smile. Bai Shuili snorted. "But we're going to your mother's house for dinner. It's not convenient. Let's eat alone." He took her hand and walked toward the door. Chapter 3729, Marriage Proposal 1. She froze for a moment. "Not bringing Serena? What do you think?" He smiled. Bai Shuili hugged his arm. "I don't like it when you look at beautiful women." "Beautiful?" Yim Yulin recalled the face that had undergone plastic surgery and frowned. "Far worse than you." That shallow little worm couldn't help but be delighted. "Really?" At this moment, they had already reached the elevator. He turned his body and looked at her. Her face was fair, and she still had big European eyes. Her nose and lips were beautiful. Moreover, she really didn't mature as she grew older. She was still the same. Time seemed to have given her special treatment. Perhaps it was because she was pure. Yim Yulin stretched out his hand and caressed her face gently. Bai Shuili always felt that he was going to say something touching, but Yim Yulin always exceeded her imagination. His voice was hoarse. "Why is there only one person? She's dumber than a pig, and I still like her." After saying that, he let go of her face and stood there as if he was angry at himself. Because he liked a girl with the intelligence of a pig. Bai Shuili was hopping mad. He despised her again, and he even called her a pig. He was the real pig. He was as lustful as a breeding pig. When he got into the car, he came back to his senses. His little pig was still angry, and her mouth was very high. "President Bai, are you angry?" He buckled his seatbelt and tapped his fingers on the steering wheel happily. A man nourished by love. Bai Shuili turned her body and didn't look at him. He was too hateful. Yim Yulin looked at her angry face and smiled. He reached out and pinched her face. "Let's go home. I'll cook for you." "HM?" She finally turned her head. "Are there any additional conditions?" Yim Yulin started the car and looked relaxed. There's one thing. You have to accompany me at night." As he said that, he reached out and held her hand with a hint of secrecy. Bai Shuili was stunned for a moment and then bit her lips. She knew that there was no lunch for an idiot in this world. No, it was a free dinner. Angry, and still angry, he finally spoke his mind. "Yim Yulin, you're a pig." However, he was not angry. "I'm a breeding pig, but you still like me to death. Otherwise, why would you be so angry when Serena invited me to dinner just now?" "Treat us to dinner," she emphasized. He chuckled. "Are you sure she wants to invite you?" Bai Shuili didn't say anything. After a while, she whispered, "Yim Yulin, can you stop bullying me like this?" He was surprised, but then he smiled. "I'll try my best, but surely this is fun." As he said that, he reached out and pinched her little face. "Little silly, stupid pig worm." She howled, took his hand off, and held it in her arms. He didn't say anything and just hugged her. Actually, to her, those Jia-he things were not important. Seeing George's ashen face, she was not too happy either. To her, being with him every day was a very happy thing. She couldn't help but rub her face on his arm and act coquettishly. "Yim Yulin, have I ever said that I love you very much?" He said seriously. "It seems to be the first time." She wrinkled her little nose. "Really? Yes. So don't you owe me a lot?" Yim Yulin reached out and touched her little head. Bai Shuili thought about it and felt that it was right. Yim Yulin smiled silently. "How dare you say that you're not a pig? I'll update again tonight." End of this chapter. Chapter 3730. Yim Yulin took her home. Halfway through the car, she was a little uneasy again. She looked at him eagerly. "Yulin, shall we take it home?" She had not been with him for 2 days, and she somewhat missed him. As she asked, she looked at Yim Yulin intently, looking at him longingly. Yim Yulin tilted his head and glanced at her, then smiled lightly. "My mother called today and said that Nin is doing well with her. She also wants him to stay for a while." "Really?" She looked at him doubtfully. Yim Yulin sighed softly. "Shueli, when did you become so distrustful of me?" Still staring at him, she said very slowly, "Since I found you very nice." He chuckled. "Which man isn't a pervert? Tell me." Of course, she couldn't answer as she counted on her fingers. Yulin reached out and held her hand. He couldn't bear to tease her anymore. When they returned home, there was a table full of dishes. They were still steaming hot, but there was no one at home. Baishuli looked at him and then at him. Then, she wrapped her arms around his neck. "Didn't you say that you cooked?" "Who cooked?" He pinched her nose as if he was thinking. "I told you that we have a Tian Luo girl at home, but you didn't believe me." She leaned on his shoulder and laughed. After a while, she looked at him eagerly. "Yulin, I can actually cook at home." He knew what she meant. She was willing to cook for him and take care of the children, just like any other woman. She wanted to be a good wife and a good mother, but he couldn't bear to do that. He reached out to hold her little hand and rubbed it a few times. His voice was gentle. "We're together again." She let out an "oh" and was carried up by him. He carried her like a little doll and placed her on the dining chair. She was a little curious and a little uneasy. She felt that it was too much to be pampered at such an age. Besides, he was really very busy during the day. She never thought that Yulin would pamper her like this. She bit her lower lip, looked up, and reached out to tug at him. "Sit down and eat too." He smiled and sat down. She scooped some rice for him, and the two of them ate quietly. It was heartwarming. After dinner, he carried her to the bedroom. She didn't object, but her little hand grabbed the collar of his shirt, feeling a little nervous. Everything happened naturally. As he said, they were back together again, so nothing was too much for them to do. He wanted her, so she hugged him and cooperated. She was very obedient. Yulin happily did it twice. Seeing that she was so tired but still accompanied him, he couldn't bear to see her accompany him, so he let her go. After everything was over, he carried her to wash up and put her under the warm blanket. Just at this moment, his phone rang. Yulin was about to pick it up when Baishuli woke up in a daze. "What's wrong?" He kissed her face. "I'll answer the phone. Be good and sleep first." She made an "oh" sound and said in a daze, "Then I'll go to sleep first. Come over early." He smiled and walked out quietly with his phone in hand. The call was from Secretary Li, and it was urgent. After he picked it up, Secretary Li said directly, "Chief, Shuai Li and Anne's identities have been exposed. I've checked, and it was exposed by a person named George. Right now, the mainstream media is still waiting for the chief's explanation. They don't dare to write anything, but there are a lot of rumors online." Yulin said calmly, "Keep it under control. We'll talk about it tomorrow morning." Secretary Li wasn't sure, and his voice became even calmer. "I'll have to discuss this with Wen Yuan." He was prepared, but he was afraid that Wen Yuan wasn't ready. Secretary Li hesitated, but in the end, she still agreed. Actually, she wanted to say that if this matter were to blow up, it would affect Yulin's future. But after thinking about it, Yulin probably didn't care about such a position. So, let affect it, but they didn't expect that someone would stand up before him. It was none other than Wen Yuan. Chapter 37-31. Wen Yuan faced the tricky questions of the reporters alone. She said calmly under the spotlight, "Mr. Yulin and I divorced a few months ago, so the rumors on the internet about Mr. Ye's illicit relationship are not true. That's all I want to say." She wouldn't say too much because it would be used against her. She was about to leave under the protection of her bodyguards, but a reporter asked a sharp question. "Ms. Wan, is your son Yulin's child?" This question was tantamount to suspecting their marriage. If Wen Yuan admitted that Xiangnan wasn't Yulin's child, it would have a great impact on Xiangnan. She looked at the reporter and answered softly, "Yi Xiangnan is of course the child of the Yi family. There is no doubt about it." This answer was very subtle. The child of the Yi family was not Yulin's child. She didn't answer the question anymore and walked out directly. But she saw Yi move by at the door. She didn't know why he arrived earlier than Yulin. There was anger on his face, and he grabbed her hand. "Wen Yuan, are you crazy?" Did she know how big the impact was after she announced such a news? Would the Wen family let her go? Without Yulin's protection, it would be difficult for her to move forward. Didn't she think about all these? Did she just come to help others? He used to think that she was cunning, but now he only thought that she was stupid. Did she think that she was powerful enough to handle it? He dragged her to another room. The door slammed shut, and he rudely pressed against the door. He stared at her face. What do you want Xiangnan to do in the future? Xiangnan isn't Yulin's child. Do you want me to keep that position and let his real daughter and wife be his mistress? Wen Yuan's voice was very soft. Yimu Bai, I can't do it, and I'm not that selfish. Yimu Bai was shocked. After a while, he growled, The child isn't my brother's. Why did you marry him? Why did you let Xiangnan's surname be Yi? To him, this was simply inconceivable. Wen Yuan's expression was fearless. She looked at Yimu Bai and smiled faintly. There was nothing between us. Why would I hesitate when this marriage should have ended? And I don't need to explain anything to you. After saying that, she wanted to leave, but her wrist was caught by him. Her back was pressed against the door again, and it hurt. He stared into her eyes and said very softly, There's nothing between you and him. Then why did you seduce me before? Without waiting for her reply, he continued, pretending to be intimate with me to arouse my interest. Wen Yuan, if this isn't seduction, then what is? She knew that she couldn't escape, so she leaned against the door and looked at him with a sneer. Yimu Bai, have you been seduced? He approached her, his thin lips touching the side of her face. His voice was very soft. I'm not interested in married women who have given birth to children. That's great. Let go of me. I want to leave. She said expressionlessly. Yimu Bai still held her hand, and his eyes narrowed coldly. Believe it or not, once you go out, there will be reporters everywhere. You can't go out at all. They will skin you alive. Wen Yuan sneered like him. Now, it's more like you who wants to skin me alive, Yimu Bai. She liked him and was crazy about him. But after waiting for him again and again, she decided to give up. She didn't want to wait for a man who never cared about her. She didn't want to please a man who would only give her a check and give her pills after having sex. He didn't love her. She knew a long time ago. She had always been the one who took the initiative, and she had always been the one who threw herself at him. She was cheap. She was shameless. She was too optimistic. Everything was over. She wanted to leave B City with Xiangnan and start a new life. Yi Mulin had given her a lot. She could live a good life, even if she left the Wen family. Perhaps she would find another man. Next time, she would find someone who liked her, who would treat her very well, who would coax her, and who would love Xiangnan. She wanted someone who wasn't fierce at all. Happy Christmas Eve, everyone. Update tomorrow. Please remember the original domain name of this book. Jiutian Shanhuang Mobile Version Website. Chapter 37-32. He stared at her face and said very slowly, Is that so? Do you think that I would have lust for a child's mother? He let go of her. You think too highly of yourself. He then looked at her suspiciously. You can't seduce my brother, so you set your sights on me. Let me tell you, I don't need you to tell me. Wen Yuan closed her eyes. A tear was already at the corner of her eye, but she didn't let it fall. Yimu Bai, I won't like you and I won't seduce you. Is that okay? After she finished speaking, the tear in the corner of her eye still fell down disappointingly. Yimu Bai was stunned for a moment. Then, he looked at her tear and seemed to be possessed after a long time. He said in a hoarse voice, Do you really love him? Wen Yuan looked up and looked at him with tears in her eyes. She didn't say anything, but he took it seriously. To Wen Yuan, let him misunderstand. That way, it wouldn't be too embarrassing. Yimu Bai said softly, I can still take care of you and Xiangnan when you go to America. He really liked Xiangnan and was willing to take care of them. After all, they wouldn't have anyone to rely on in the future. Wen Yuan didn't say that she wasn't going to New York because she didn't want to say it. He would know when he found out. When that time came, he wouldn't have to take care of her, and he would be able to relax. No matter what, the man in front of her was the man she liked. There were tears in Wen Yuan's eyes. She just hummed and thanked him. She pushed him away gently and walked past him. When she left, her hair brushed against his chest. Yimu Bai looked at her side profile and felt the last bit of warmth she left. He had an urge to hug her. It was an urge that belonged to a man towards a woman. However, he restrained himself. He watched her go, watched her open the door, and suddenly caught her wrist from behind. Wen Yuan turned her head and looked at him. His voice was deep. I'll send you back. Wen Yuan lowered his eyes and paused for a moment. When he thought of the reporters at the entrance, he nodded. She thought that she could really let it go. If she didn't, she would be embarrassed. She heard that Yi Mu Bai went to his girlfriend's house to meet his parents. He might get married, and if she continued to pester him like this, what would happen? She felt a little disgusted with herself. She felt that her life had been influenced by an idol from her youth. He was no longer the person she liked when she was young. They even had a child, and that was enough. On the way back, when Yuan sat in the back seat of his car and looked out the window at the street, it was especially quiet in the car. She just sat quietly in the car and quietly got along with him. She thought this is the last time. As Yi Mu Bai drove, he would occasionally notice her behind the car. He looked at Wen Yuan in the rearview mirror. To be honest, she was very good-looking. Her looks weren't particularly outstanding, but her eyebrows were very comfortable and pleasant to look at. Perhaps because she had been pampered since she was young. Wen Yuan looked gentle and not aggressive. She was very suitable to be a wife. Yi Mu Bai suddenly thought of the night he saw in the villa. Wen Yuan was wearing spaghetti-strap pajamas and sat on Yi Mulin's knees. Her long black hair was messy and fell on her shoulders. From behind, it was a visual impact and very sexy. He suddenly felt a little uncomfortable. He couldn't tell why they were acting like a fake couple. He thought about how she had indeed seduced him before, but now she had given up. Had she really given up? He couldn't help but think. It's late at night. Try to be earlier today. This book came from. Chapter 37-33. Yi Mu Bai wasn't paying attention as he drove. Later, when Yuan's phone rang, it was Yi Mulin. She picked it up. Her voice was a little nasal, and she didn't speak much. She just hummed a few times before hanging up. Yi Mu Bai looked at the rearview mirror. He only glanced at her and saw that her nose was a little red, as if she had been crying. He paused and asked softly, "Did he scold you?" "No." When Yuan looked out of the window and said softly, "I'm just a little sad." Then she murmured as if she was talking to herself, "I've lived with him for a few years, and now I'm a little sad." You won't understand. To her, Yi Mulin was a warm existence. When she was most helpless, he gave her a place to shelter from the rain. Otherwise, she might have left the city with Xiangnan a few years ago. In her heart, Yi Mulin had long been a family member, so when Yuan could not be so selfish. She could not be like before, relying on her status as the eldest miss of the one family to chase after a man relentlessly. If this continued, even she would look down on herself. She said slowly. Yi Mu Bai clenched his fingers. "You care about him a lot?" When Yuan looked up in surprise and looked at the back of his head. After a while, she smiled faintly. "Yi Mu Bai, you're thinking too much." It wasn't what he thought. What did he think? Did he think that she had that kind of feelings for Yi Mulin? As soon as she said that, the car came to a screeching stop. She paused for a moment and then looked at him with a hint of helplessness in her eyes. "When Yuan, if you love him, you can get him back. If you don't love him, then give up now because he's going to get married." He gripped the steering wheel tightly. "If you don't want to be an outsider and don't want to embarrass yourself, then break it off completely." Wen Yuan listened to his words and felt like it was a lifetime ago. She had heard these words before. Before he lost his memory, he always warned her not to be delusional. Was he going to say these words to her now? However, what he said, it made sense. She didn't defend herself and just said softly, "Xiangnan, and I will leave. What you're worried about won't happen." It was true that she wanted to leave, but it wasn't New York. At this moment, she suddenly wanted to seduce him. For the last time, she had seduced Yi Mu Bai, who had lost his memory. She had made him always remember and hate her in his heart. This could be considered her revenge against him. Half an hour later, Yi Mu Bai's car stopped in the villa. Wen Yuan placed his hand on the car door as if he was about to get out, but she stopped herself and turned to look at him. "Do you want to see Miss Nan?" Yi Mu Bai placed his fingers on the steering wheel. In fact, he didn't have this plan at first. He was going to watch a musical with Lin Shui. If nothing unexpected happened, he would probably get engaged to her. Yi Mu Bai was going to Yi Mu Bai. When Yuan saw the hesitation in his eyes and forced a smile, If you have something to do, then forget it. Yi Mubai wanted to forget about it, but when she got out of the car, and he was about to start the car, Xiangnan ran out of the villa and called out to him. Tee up! Yi! Tee he up! Just like when Yuan had said, although he wasn't Yi Mulin's child, he felt that he was the Yi family's child. He immediately gave up and turned off the car. He opened the car door and got out. He picked up the little thing and held it high. Xiangnan, do you miss Uncle? Xiangnan's answer was to kiss him hard on the cheek. Chapter 37-34. Yi Mubai's heart was very soft, and he kissed Xiangnan. Perhaps it was the nature of a father and son. He liked Xiangnan very much, but at this time, Yi Mubai would never have thought that Xiangnan was his child. He forgot everything, and he easily accepted his family. He was not obsessed with remembering, but his forgetfulness made him forget the most important thing. He, and Wen Yuan, had a relationship. He held Xiangnan and played with Xiangnan. Xiangnan was very young. He secretly looked at his mother, and only when he found that his mother was not angry, he was relieved. At this time, it was almost noon. Yi Mubai had an appointment with Lin Shui, or it should be said that Lin Shui asked him out. Before he went over, Lin Shui called him, but the phone was in the car, so Yi Mubai did not hear it. And when Yuan quietly watched him play with Xiangnan, she looked very happy to see Xiangnan. Xiangnan had not been so happy for a long time. Wen Yuan's eyes were a little hot. She did not know if she did something wrong, and if she should not give up so easily, but she did not have the courage to try again. It was almost noon, and she went to the kitchen to ask the servants to prepare lunch. There was Xiangnan's favorite food, and also Yi Mubai's favorite food, if his taste hadn't changed. After she quietly ordered, she went upstairs to the living room alone and sat for a while. In fact, her luggage was already packed, and she was waiting to leave. Not to New York, but to H-City. A music academy in H-City had accepted her, and she also bought a good apartment in H-City. She was very grateful to Yi Mulin for this. He let her live respectfully after leaving the Wen family, and she also knew that half of it was for Yi Mubai. No matter what, she was going to leave this place, and she was a little reluctant. When Yuan's fingers fell in front of piano, many nights, when she thought of Yi Mubai, she would play this piano. At that time, Xiangnan would listen quietly by the side, as if he could understand. When Yuan smiled faintly, but it was a bitter smile. At lunchtime, both Xiangnan and Yi Mubai were sweating. After lunch, he took the little fellow to the guest room upstairs to take a shower. Probably because he was too tired, Xiangnan fell asleep after a while. Yi Mubai accompanied him for a while, then walked out with only a towel wrapped around his waist. He suddenly thought of Lin Shui's date. Actually, he didn't really like her, he just didn't hate her. He went downstairs to his car and took out his phone. He frowned when he saw the 5 missed calls and a few WeChat messages. He had forgotten everything. It was already 2 in the afternoon. He called her. Lin Shui was angry, but she did not dare to lose her temper at him. Instead, she acted like a spoiled child for a while, asking him to compensate her. Yi Mubai looked at himself and said in a low voice, "There's still time for the concert. Wait for me there. I'll be there on time." Lin Shui actually wanted to ask where he was, but she swallowed the words when they were on the tip of her tongue. Yi Mubai hung up the phone and went to the second floor. He wanted to ask Wen Yuan for a set of Yi Mulin's clothes. Their figures were similar, but when he knocked on the door, Wen Yuan was only wearing a bathrobe. It was obvious that he had just taken a shower. She looked at him and was stunned for a moment. "I thought it was Xiangnan." After saying that, she subconsciously wanted to close the door. An arm blocked the door. Yi Mubai pushed the door open and said calmly, "No need. I want to borrow a set of my brother's clothes. I'm going out later." Book from Chapter 37-35. Wen Yuan looked at him and nodded. "His clothes are in his room. I'll take you there." Yi Mubai's eyebrows twitched. Only then did he realize that the divorced couple had been sleeping in separate rooms. Wen Yuan adjusted his bathrobe and walked toward the opposite room. Yi Mubai followed and closed the door behind him. It was obvious that Yi Mulin had stayed here before. Everything was the same as before, but some of his clothes might have been taken away, so the changing room was a little empty. Wen Yuan opened a few cabinets, but she couldn't find anything that suited him. It wasn't until the last cabinet that she found a suit that also suited Yimu Bai. She gave it to him, then bent down to look for a matching tie and shoes. Her bathrobe was short, and when she bent down, Yimu Bai saw something he shouldn't have seen. It was very tempting. His Adam's apple couldn't help but move. It was hard to imagine that Wen Yuan would have such a devilish figure under such a calm face. To be honest, he was a man. If he said that he didn't have any thoughts, he wouldn't be a man. Wen Yuan seemed to have finally found his tie and got up to give it to him. Yimu Bai reached out and took it, thanking him. She wanted to walk out, but he reached out and pulled her back. In the next second, she was pressed against the closet. However, his actions were not too rough. At this moment, Yimu Bai had no intention of doing anything to her. He just stared into her eyes and accused. "You seduced me again." Wen Yuan bit her lips and turned her face to the side. Her heart was pounding. "I don't know what you mean." He stared at her, his eyes on fire. Yimu Bai had always been hesitant. Sometimes he suspected that she was seducing him, sometimes he felt that she was not. At this moment, he really wanted to know whether she was seducing him or not. So he moved his body forward to trap her. Lowering his head, he kissed the corner of her lips and murmured, "If you're not seducing me, reject me now." Her eyes were misty, and her chest was heaving even more violently, almost touching him. His young body was ignited with a single spark. Yimu Bai gently bites her soft lips. "Refusing me proves that you didn't seduce me." Wen Yuan was trapped by him. It was very, very hot. She also felt like crying. In front of her was the man she had loved for so many years. When she was pregnant with his child, she thought he was dead. He came back, but he didn't recognize her. He hated her, just like before. She told herself to be willful for the last time. She did not reject him. Instead, she wrapped her arms around his neck and kissed him with her eyes closed. Yimu Bai was stunned for a moment. Then he felt something fall to the ground, and then he was controlled by Yuan. The adult man and woman embraced, kissed, and used all their imaginations to please each other's bodies. There was no love, but it was the most primitive desire between a man and a woman. Yimu Bai admitted that he was not a man who valued jade, but she seduced him again and again. Her figure was surprisingly good. Although she had given birth to a child, it was very suitable for a man to hug her. Yimu Bai went from being rough at the beginning to being engrossed in it. He didn't let go of her body the whole afternoon, hugging her again and again. His phone kept ringing, but no one paid attention to it. On Yi Mulin's gray bed sheets, he passionately loved the woman who had just left his sister-in-law's identity. Perhaps there were some taboos about her identity, so it was especially different. In the end, he couldn't even remember how many times he had done it, but he felt very happy. That's the end of the update. Good night, dearest M. I would like to chat with more like-minded people about new wife number 1. Husband, addicted to pampering, winky face, winky face, winky face, winky face, talking about life, looking for a bosom friend. Chapter 37-36. When everything calmed down, it was already nightfall. Yimu Bai's cell phone had already run out of battery, and it lay on the side of his pillow in the dark and lonely light. His muscular body leaned on her, and he lowered his head to kiss her lips. Wen Yuan closed her eyes and gasped for breath. After a while, she opened her eyes and stared at him. Her voice was soft. "Yimu Bai, is this considered as me seducing you?" His gaze was deep. Then, he rolled to the side and said quietly, "I didn't take any precautions. Are you going to take your medicine or let nature take its course?" He was giving her a choice. If she took the pill, everything that had happened between them today would be over. But if she didn't take the pill, she might get pregnant and the child could not be aborted. He would choose to marry her. Wen Yuan stared at the ceiling. After a long time, she tilted her head and asked him, "Yimu Bai, do you like me at all?" He clenched his fists and answered honestly, "I have a desire for you." After he said that, her eyes were a little warm and sad. Even though some things were about to break out of the cocoon, she still held them back. She sat up and said softly, "I'll take the medicine." Yimu Bai was annoyed. He sat up, leaned against the headboard, and lit a cigarette. You can also choose not to take the medicine. Do you love me? When Yuan's eyes were filled with tears, she bit her lips and looked at Yimu Bai. Tell me you love me. At this moment, she felt like she was in a nightmare. It was as if she had returned to the time when she begged him for his love. She looked at him as if it were years ago, but Yimu Bai looked at her as a woman who had just gone to bed. Although he liked this woman very much, it was just an accident after all. However, he was the mastermind behind this accident, and he knew it very well. At this moment, she asked him if he loved her. He could make it up to her, but he couldn't say that he loved her against his heart. His voice was slightly hoarse. If you want compensation, as soon as he finished speaking, she reacted fiercely. Yimu Bai, I'm not for sale. Yimu Bai frowned. That's not what I meant. When Yuan tugged at his hair and looked up, you should leave. The clothes are over there. I'll take my medicine. I won't bring you any trouble, and I won't tell Miss Lin about this either. Yimu Bai's frown deepened. I'll ask you one last time. What I want is someone who loves me. She finally burst into tears and hugged herself like a homeless stray animal. But you're not. Yimu Bai's voice was slightly cold. Is love that important? Wen Yuan raised his eyes and looked at him for a long time before he murmured, Yimu Bai, it's not that you haven't liked someone before. You just don't remember. Do you still remember Lin Cece? Yimu Bai's expression was somewhat unsightly. Lin Cece. It was a name that made his heart ache. The person you like is going to remarry her ex-husband. You should have heard of Gu Zhe, the CEO of Hungtong Group. After losing her, he chased after her for many years. When Yuan smiled, Yimu Bai, I don't want you to think that you don't know how to love someone for the rest of your life. In fact, you have loved someone, but the person you love is not me or Lin Shui. She raised her head and let her tears fall. Everything was over. She gave up. When she looked at him again, his expression was very unsightly. After a moment, Yimu Bai began to put on his clothes. He jumped out of bed and was about to leave, but he turned back. He said to her beside the bed, I'll ask my assistant to send the check. Chapter 37:37. When Yuan's tears didn't stop, she half knelt on the bed, wrapped in bed sheets. She smiled through her tears. I'll buy the medicine myself. I don't need the check. Don't worry, I won't have another child with a man who doesn't love me. She seemed to be saying to herself, never again. Yimu Bai stared into her eyes, then pinched her chin and bent down. Is there anything else you haven't told me? Her chin was a little sore. She looked up. Nothing. Yimu Bai let go of her and walked out quickly. His steps were hurried, but when Yuan knew that he definitely wasn't going to find Lin Shui, he was going to find his past. When Yuan just sat there, smiling softly, Yimu Bai went downstairs, got into the car, and held the steering wheel. When he picked up his phone to make a call, he realized that it was out of battery, so he charged it. After a while, he called King. His tone was indifferent. I want to check my past. King was very straightforward. 1 million. I'll send it to your phone in 10 minutes. Yimu Bai's voice was cold. I don't want the official news on the internet. I want privacy, something that no one else knows except for me. King laughed. Look at the information. Give me a price. But it'll be a little late. It'll take a day or two. Yimu Bai hung up. He sat in the car for a long time. Then he got out again, lit a cigarette in the dark, and looked upstairs. He looked at that room. The lights were on, but it was frighteningly quiet. Was she still crying? He was a little annoyed. Why did she have to ask for love from him? Why did she ask for something that she shouldn't ask for? Actually, he felt that when Yuan wasn't determined to have him, she was even doing it with him with the mentality of a one-night stand. When he wanted her, she was very cooperative and enjoyed it. He was a man. Although he hadn't had a woman in a long time, he could feel that she hadn't had a man in a long time. At that moment, he thought, who was the last man she had been with? Was she also like this? When that man wanted her, she couldn't wait to hug that man. Yimu Bai's expression became very ugly. He threw away the cigarette, but stepped on it, reached out to open the car door, and drove away without hesitation. He was even a little annoyed. He was the one who had taken advantage of the situation. For some reason, he drove to a building that looked a little old. He was able to get here by instinct. Perhaps he used to drive here often. Yimu Bai sat in the car, and didn't go anywhere. He just quietly smoked. Two people came down from the staircase. One of them was a very beautiful girl who looked familiar. Yi Mubai's heart even moved slightly because of her appearance. Behind him was a man he knew, Guze. Guze was carrying a suitcase in his hand, and he easily placed it in the trunk of a car. Then he grabbed the arm of the girl in front of him, pressed her against the back of the car, and kissed her for a while. Finally, they drove away. Coincidentally, he had seen the entire process. This was the Lin Cece that Wen Yuan had mentioned. A girl who was going to marry someone else before he could remember. Even if he couldn't remember, his heart would still hurt. Yi Mubai's fingers gently stroked the steering wheel, and he suddenly felt a little hatred for Wen Yuan. Why did she tell him? This was almost revenge. Making someone feel pain was the best revenge. End of this chapter. Chapter 37-38. Yi Mubai's car was parked outside the apartment for the entire night. Later, Lin Shui called. He just gave a few perfunctory replies and hung up. On the other end, Lin Shui wanted to explode, but she didn't dare to. She didn't even dare to call him again. Yi Mubai leaned against the back of the chair and smoked. He was thinking a lot. His past with Lin Cece, an entanglement with Wen Yuan in the afternoon. At dawn, he drove back to the hotel. After he took a shower, he received news from King. It was much faster than he had expected. Yi Mubai dried his hair as he received the news. It was some photos of him and Lin Cece, probably taken by the paparazzi. There were even photos of them kissing. He looked at himself quietly, looking at the way he looked at Lin Cece. He was sure that he had liked her. Otherwise, he wouldn't have looked at her like that. King made a call. Yi Mubai said quietly, "I'll transfer the money to you later." King stopped him and smiled. "These can be given away for free. There's also the highlight. Do you want it?" Yi Mubai narrowed his eyes. "What do you mean?" King smiled maliciously. "It's a very explosive photo. I think they probably spent money to keep it under wraps." Yi Mubai listened quietly, waiting for King to continue. King's voice suddenly became serious. "Mubai, the woman before you lost your memory wasn't Lin Cece. Even if there was a bit of romance between the two of you, it was stopped in time. The one who really maintained a long-term relationship with you, or rather, a physical relationship with you, was Wen Yuan, your ex-sister-in-law. I have a lot of photos that can prove that the two of you maintained a sexual relationship for at least a year." Yi Mubai's fingers tightened on his phone. There was no warmth in his voice. "Send me the photos." King sent them over immediately. One after another, it was very exciting. They were all photos of Yi Mubai and Wen Yuan. There were even short videos and videos of him doing all sorts of things to Wen Yuan in front of the camera. Each photo was more exciting than the one before. He watched in silence, his expression growing heavier and heavier. If he and Wen Yuan had maintained such a relationship, then whose child was Xiangnan? Yi Mubai put down his phone and dialed King's number. "I'll get my assistant to send you a check in a while. I'll make sure you'll be satisfied." King was not worried about this. The Yi brothers had always been generous. Yi Mubai hung up the phone, took off his bathrobe, put on his clothes, and jumped into the car, driving directly to Wen Yuan's villa. More than an hour later, the car stopped. He got off the car and walked straight to the hall. In the hall, there were two servants cleaning, and there were several cardboard boxes piled up. Yi Mubai raised his head and asked, "Where's Wen Yuan?" The servants and the family didn't know much, but everyone knew what happened yesterday afternoon. Second young master slept with Miss One. This relationship was messy enough. The servant shivered. Madam left with the young master early in the morning. Yi Mubai furrowed his brows. "Where did she go?" "I don't know. Madam didn't say. She only said to clean up the place and close the door. She might not come back for a few years," the servant said truthfully. Yi Mubai had a bad feeling. He narrowed his eyes and thought of Wen Yuan's pandering yesterday. Obviously, it meant for the last time. End of this chapter. Chapter 37-39. Yi Mubai immediately called King. "Help me find out where Wen Yuan went." King shook his head and sighed. "Mubai, are you sure you want to look for her? Are you going to marry her? Her son might be mine." Yi Mubai gritted his teeth. He wanted to strangle that woman to death. What was this? Sleeping with him before leaving so that he would never forget her? What kind of woman was she? She looked gentle and quiet, but in reality, the things she did were more shocking than the previous one. On the other side, King smiled. You can ask Chiefy about this, because he was the one who suppressed those photos. For the sake of Wen Yuan's evil eye, he was willing to spend a fortune. He paused. After you get the answer, do you want to look for Wen Yuan? Yimu Bai held the phone so tightly that his fingers almost turned white. After a moment, he thanked him and put down the phone. He walked to the car and opened the door. The servants were worried and ran over to ask, Second young master, what happened? Yimu Bai's expression didn't look good. It's nothing. If Wen Yuan calls, don't tell him I came. Under the servant's surprised gaze, he started the car and left. It was Sunday. Yi Mulin was in the condominium. Yimu Bai drove the car over, went up to the top floor, and pressed the doorbell fiercely, causing a couple who were in the middle of doing it to lose interest. Especially when Yi Mulin opened the door with a black face, wearing only a bathrobe. It was Yimu Bai who opened the door. Yi Mulin frowned. What are you doing here so early in the morning? Yimu Bai took 2 steps inside and asked in a tense voice, Is Wen Yuan's child mine? Yi Mulin still frowned. Is she pregnant? Brother, you know what I'm asking. Don't play dumb with me. Yimu Bai asked seriously again. Is he Xiangnan my son? Yi Mulin stared at him. After a while, he slowly said, Looks like you know something. Yi Mulin took a cigarette from the vestibule, lit it, and said to Yimu Bai, Have a smoke and sit over there. I'll come out after I talk to Shirley. Yimu Bai was particularly annoyed. He took a pack of cigarettes and a lighter, walked over to the sofa, lit it, and looked at him. Hurry up. Yi Mulin smiled faintly, walked quickly into the bedroom, and closed the door. Bai Shuli sat up and asked, Why is little Bai here? Yi Mulin walked over and sat on the edge of the bed. His affair with Wen Yuan has been exposed. He gently ruffled her hair. I think they accidentally overslept again. Wen Yuan left, and now he's starting to suspect that Xiangnan is his son. I'll talk to him for a while. You can sleep for a while longer. He lowered his head and kissed her forehead. Good girl. She pulled his arm. Is it possible for them to be together? Yi Mulin shook his head. I don't know. The reason why he didn't tell Yimu Bai directly was that he didn't care about Wen Yuan a few years ago. He just maintained a physical relationship with him. He wasn't responsible for it, but he couldn't bear to not sleep with him. Not to mention now, there was no reason to use Xiangnan to do anything. It wouldn't be good for Xiangnan. Yi Mulin patted his little wife. Good girl, don't think too much. Bai Shuli nodded and lay down. After Yi Mulin left and closed the door, she secretly took out her phone and sent a WeChat message to Lin Cece. Cece, it's over. Little Bai found out that Xiangnan is his son, but Wen Yuan ran away. Chapter 3740. On the other side, Lin Cece replied to Bai Shuli with a surprised expression. She knew that Yimu Bai had forgotten everything, but she really didn't expect that Wen Yuan's son was Yimu Bai's. Many years ago, Yimu Bai had slept with Yi Mulin's fiancée. Just thinking about it was exciting enough. The 2 girls chatted for a long time under the quilt. Guze came out of the bathroom and saw Lin Cece playing with her phone. Her pinky finger was missing. His heart ached for a moment, but he still smiled and went over. Who are you talking to? Lin Cece put down her phone and looked at him. It's Shirley. Guze was only wearing a bathrobe. He leaned against the headboard and looked down at her. What do they say? Lin Cece and Guze had reconciled. She was no longer as cold as before and was acting coquettishly. She looked at him and bit her lower lip. I said you can't be unhappy. Guze held her waist and smiled faintly. It depends on what you're talking about. Lin Cece leaned into the crook of his arm and looked up at him. Then she moved her little face closer to his, her fingers gently caressing his lips. It's about Mu Bai. Guze and Yimu Bai were rivals in love. Yimu Bai liked Lin Cece for a long time. At this moment, his little wife said that she was talking about Yimu Bai. President Gu snorted, picked up a cigarette, lit it, and took a puff. Tell me about it. Lin Cece leaned into his arms and took away his cigarette. You're not allowed to smoke. What if I get pregnant? She stroked her belly and looked at him. Guze, I really want a child. Guze smiled. You want children? You have to work hard. As he spoke, he was about to press her down again. Lin Cece hugged his neck and stopped him. Let's talk business. In fact, Guze was just pretending, and then he just smiled and let it go. Lin Cece hugged him and said softly, when Yuan's child is Yimu Bai's. Shirley told me just now. Now when Yuan seems to have left B City. Old Bai's going crazy. Guze snorted. Feeling sorry for her. I didn't. She hugged him and whispered, Guze, we're going to get married. Can you stop being jealous? He smiled faintly, hugged her, and kissed her again. His mood was complicated, but at the same time, it was soft. After so many years, she had turned back into the little fool she used to be. She was willing to let him love her again. While Guze and Lin Cece were in a good relationship, the Yi brothers were not as warm. Yi Mulin walked out, closed the door, and sat opposite Yimu Bai. Yimu Bai smoked fiercely and looked up. There was a hint of red in his eyes. Can you tell me now? Is Xiangnan my son? Yi Mulin also lit a cigarette. After taking a puff, he looked at Yi Mubai and smiled. If he is, what will you do? Yi Mubai stared at him. Yi Mulin sighed. When Yuan has liked you for many years. Mubai, I have something to tell you, because you are my brother. He said slowly, before you lost your memory, your relationship with Wen Yuan was just one of flesh and blood. You didn't promise her anything, and perhaps you didn't love her. Now, I think it's more or less the same. Wen Yuan probably left because he gave up. If that's the case, do you still want to get her back? Do you want to marry her, or take back the custody of Xiangnan? Do you want to marry Lin Shui and let Xiangnan have a stepmother? Update tomorrow morning. Chapter 3741. Yimu Bai took a drag of his cigarette and looked up. I won't marry Lin Shui. Yi Mulin smiled faintly and then looked at Yimu Bai. Then are you going to marry Wen Yuan? How are you going to treat her after you marry her? Are you going to treat her with respect or be as cold as ice? Are you going to leave her in City B alone in New York or bring her to New York with you? He paused. Mubai, if Wen Yuan is another Lin Shui, forget it. Let her go and let yourself go. He got up and patted Yi Mubai's shoulder. I don't want to repeat what happened many years ago. Yi Mubai clenched his fingers. Tell me her address. Even if it's not for Wen Yuan, Xiangnan is my son. I cannot see him in this life, right? You have to find out yourself. Wen Yuan didn't tell me either. Yi Mulin shook his head. Mubai, calm down and think about what to do next. Calm down? Yi Mubai couldn't calm down. Wen Yuan's departure and yesterday afternoon's intimacy seemed to have thrown a huge bomb into his heart. He had never felt that there was a woman as despicable as her. She ran away after sleeping with him, and they even had a son. Yi Mubai narrowed his eyes and got up. Yi Mulin also got up, but as soon as he got up, Yi Mubai punched him. With a bang, Yi Mubai's body sank into the sofa again. He covered his nose and cursed. Bastard, I've helped you raise your son for so long. Yi Mubai glared at him and slammed the door. At this time, Bai Shuli also ran out. Seeing her husband's nose bleeding, she immediately covered it with a tissue. Mubai, why are you like this? Yi Mulin looked at his wife's anxious look and squinted at her. Didn't you like him the most in the past? Now you know that men are violent. She said angrily, you can't even beat him. He was stunned and then smiled. When it came to her, she was always right. He did not care that his nose was bleeding. He reached out and hugged his little wife in his arms, wanting to continue being intimate. Bai Shuli naturally refused. She bit her lips and said, You're bleeding. It doesn't matter. Yi Mulin insisted on continuing. She pushed his shoulder and looked at him with a sad look. No, I mean it's dirty. Yi Mulin was stunned for a moment. He used a tissue to wipe the blood from his nose bit by bit. Then, he pounced on her like a tiger pouncing on a rabbit and pretended to bite her. I will let you know what is dirty. Bai Shuli screamed in response. Her hands and feet were pressed down by him, and she struggled to crawl forward. She had always known what he liked. She climbed all the way to the master bedroom and was already teased by him. She gently drew on his chin with her little hand and bit her lip. Are you really not going to ask about Mubai and Wen Yuan? Yi Mulin's expression was somewhat complicated. After a long while, he spat out a few words. "It's not convenient." She laughed. "Yi Mulin, your period is here. What's inconvenient about it?" He lowered his head and bit her, not too hard, making her scream. His voice was heavy. "Let me check to see if it's inconvenient for you." As he said that, he forcefully wanted to check. Bai Shuali grabbed his hand and begged for mercy in a soft voice. No matter what she said, she couldn't stop him. "And you said that my period is here, huh?" He chuckled softly and nibbled on her little chin, enjoying her to his heart's content. Please remember the original domain name of this book. Jiutian Shanhuang mobile version website. Chapter 3742. Yi Mubai went downstairs from the apartment. He sat in the car, but didn't leave immediately. Instead, he smoked 2 cigarettes. Sitting in the car, he thought about a lot and straightened out everything from the time he saw Wen Yuan again. She was shocked when she saw him. Later, when he went to the villa, she deliberately seduced him. Did she plan to seduce him when he lost his memory and sleep with him as his sister-in-law? Why didn't she mention the past? Did she think that he would fall in love with her if he could start over again? Yi Mubai smoked and then smiled coldly. He started the car and asked his assistant to book the earliest flight to New York for him. 18 hours later, Yi Mubai was lying on a recliner in a hospital in central New York. He was undergoing hypnosis, trying to recover his past memories. In the darkness, he inserted Wen Yuan into his memory. In his deep sleep, the fragments of the past pieced together, and the scenes appeared in his mind one by one. Yi Mubai suddenly opened his eyes, his forehead and back covered in cold sweat. The doctor in front of him smiled. "Mr. Yi, it seems that you have recalled the past. The reason why you forgot before was because of the existence of resistance. Now that you understand, you remember. The existence of resistance, was it Wen Yuan?" Yi Mubai closed his eyes. When he opened them again, he had already made up his mind. He got up and put on his shoes. This time, his flight flew to H City. King had found Wen Yuan's whereabouts. Of course, it also cost Yi Mubai 20 million. King was simply the black market in the industry. When Yi Mubai appeared in front of Wen Yuan, it was almost 11 o'clock on Saturday night. He had booked a hotel, but he still went directly to her apartment. It was a nice apartment, more than 100 square meters. Her family background was good. Even if she divorced and moved out, Yi Mulin wouldn't treat her badly, and she wouldn't feel wronged. Yi Mubai thought after seeing the furniture and decoration. Wen Yuan should be asleep. When he opened the door, he was wearing pajamas. He looked at him for a long time and then whispered, "Why are you here? Why else would you open the door dressed like this?" Yi Mubai squeezed in and stared at her with burning eyes. She was only wearing pajamas. Although it was pure cotton, it wasn't too thick. In Yi Mubai's eyes, it was the kind that attracted bees and butterflies. His gaze was unfriendly as he walked past her. Wen Yuan looked at him. After a long while, he finally pulled on his clothes and murmured, "What brings you here?" She remembered that they had made it clear that it was just an accident that day. She closed the door and turned her head to watch him walk to the sofa and sit down. So she also sat down. She lowered her voice to avoid waking up Xiangnan. "Yi Mubai, I've taken my medicine. Don't worry, I won't make trouble for you." He stared at her for a long time before saying softly, "Wen Yuan, I remember everything from the past." Her face was deathly pale. As for him, he looked at her face with admiration. Then, he said even more slowly, "Yi Xiangnan is my son, isn't he?" "No." Wen Yuan answered very quickly. She closed her eyes and bit her lips. "He isn't. Xiangnan. This name says it all." Yi Mubai reached out and pulled her closer. She fell into his arms in her pajamas. He was in a hurry and had been rushing back and forth. He hadn't shaved and hadn't showered for 2 days, but he was full of masculinity. She fell into his arms, smelling his scent and his body that was as hard as iron. All of this made her panic and scared. End of chapter. Chapter 3743. Yi Mubai's eyes locked onto her, and his voice became softer. "If you say no, we could do a DNA test." Wen Yuan felt weak all over. She looked at the man in front of her, closed her eyes, and murmured, "Yi Mubai, what do you want? Why don't you ask me what I want? He stroked her face gently with his fingers. Wen Yuan, actually, I want to ask you what you want. You've been trying so hard to get close to me. You gave birth to my child, but you didn't get anything. Don't you think it's a waste? As he spoke, his finger moved to her lips suggestively. It had been like this in the past. He liked her body, liked making love with her, and enjoyed it, but he had never been able to really like her. He had always loved Lin Cece, not Wen Yuan. If he liked her even a little bit, he wouldn't be willing to hurt her like this. Wen Yuan slowly opened her eyes and looked into his eyes. What do you want? Is it Xiangnan? Let's get married, Yimu Bai said quickly, but his tone was firm. Since we have a son, let's get married. I'll take you and Xiangnan to the United States. It's better for Xiangnan. He's in H City, and it'll be just as good. Wen Yuan said quickly, and then she struggled away. She retreated a step away from him, but when he reached out, she was in his arms again. Yimu Bai frowned and stared at Wen Yuan. You want Xiangnan to be a single-parent child? I'll get married again. Wen Yuan looked down and said in a low voice, I won't be single forever, Yimu Bai. We've missed each other in our lives. Without Xiangnan, we're already two unrelated people. Really? He sneered and lifted her chin. Then why did you tempt me to sleep with you that day? Wen Yuan, don't say that you didn't mean it. You're a woman. Don't you know what it means to a man when you dress like that? His fingers gently pinched her chin. And we've slept together many times. I think you know what kind of style I like best, don't you? No. No. Wen Yuan desperately shook her head, but her face was in his hand and she couldn't break free. Tonight, Yimu Bai was frightening. He stared into her eyes. No. Do you dare to say that you don't feel anything sitting on my lap? His large palm was holding her, separated only by a thin layer of fabric, which made her feel ashamed and resentful. She couldn't stand him treating her like that. She lay there and cried softly. Yimu Bai, let go of me, bastard. He withdrew his hand, still staring at her. You're the bastard if you're not satisfied, aren't you? In the past, you were so proactive and went to my place again and again. Didn't you want me to satisfy you? Didn't you just want to sleep with me? Why have you become so reserved after getting married once? He was very domineering. He directly put her down on the sofa and looked down at her eyes. Look at you. You're clearly the same as before. Stop talking. Wen Yuan bit her lips and turned her face to the side with a red nose. Yimu Bai, I'm not what you think I am. Let's end it. If you didn't want to sleep with me that day, I would really think that you've turned over a new leaf. But obviously you're not. Before you ran away, you even wanted to use me to satisfy you. He gently bit her lips. Why? You haven't had a man all these years. Is there no one who can satisfy you? Try to update 3 more chapters at night. I'm always sleepy. End of this chapter. Chapter 3744. Actually, he admitted that he was a little uncomfortable. This woman had given birth to his child, but she had been married to his brother for a few years when Yuan couldn't take it anymore. Her eyes were watery. Yimu Bai, you bastard. Leave. I don't want you here. You don't want me? His eyes were cold. If you don't want me, you chased after me every day and climbed into my bed when I was drunk. Wen Yuan, have you forgotten that you used my big brother to get close to me? Have you forgotten how you used the identity of my sister-in-law to seduce me? His fingers treated her mercilessly, and his voice was hoarse. Look at yourself. Do you want to see what you look like now? You said you don't want me, but Wen Yuan, your body doesn't show that. She was treated so badly by him that she almost couldn't speak. Yimu Bai, let me go. I don't want to be like this. He treated her mercilessly, and there was no expression on his face. Suddenly, he smiled. Wen Yuan, you've always been the one who won't let me go. She was stunned. He let go of her, sat on the other side, lit a cigarette, and took a puff. Wen Yuan sat up awkwardly and pulled up her clothes. She wanted to escape, but he said slowly, if you dare to leave, I'll do it in front of Yi Xiangnan. You won't be able to escape for the rest of your life. Her face was deathly pale. Are you afraid? Yimu Bai held the cigarette and rubbed his forehead with his thumb. Wen Yuan, why didn't you think about this day when you seduced a man? You thought you could escape after sleeping with me, didn't you? She sat there in a daze and murmured, How did you know? He stared at her eyes and smiled. There were many wonderful scenes of us in the past that were captured by the paparazzi. My brother spent a lot of money to buy them. Wen Yuan didn't say anything else. She just sat there in a daze. Yi Mubai smoked. After a long time, he looked up at her. Go to New York with me. Xiangnan needs a normal family. Wen Yuan looked at him in a daze again. Do you want me to say that I love you? Yi Mubai frowned. Wen Yuan, don't be too greedy. Wen Yuan blinked gently. Is it greedy to ask your husband to love you? Her hands were placed on her lap, just like a primary school student. In fact, she was always at a loss in front of him, always in a weak position. She looked at the man in front of her absent-mindedly and smiled sadly. Yi Mubai, I give up. Really, you must not have heard when I started to chase after you. Since you acted in your first movie, I've watched every poster of you and every movie of yours many times. It's not an exaggeration to say that I'm a fanatic fan. As she said that, she paused and licked her lips. But at the same time, I'm the eldest daughter of the Wen family. I can't chase after you all day like those little fans. Our families are well matched, and I can't chase after you all day like by Xueli. My upbringing doesn't allow me to do that. I used to envy by Xueli, and I also thought that you would end up with her, but you didn't. You fell in love with Lin Cece just when I wanted to confess to you. Wen Yuan looked a bit dazed. At that time, I thought that we weren't young anymore, and you hadn't had a girlfriend. Maybe you would be willing to settle down, and I knew that I was very suitable to be a wife. I even thought that if you had something with other women after marriage, I would be able to tolerate it. But now I feel that that kind of feeling is the feeling of a fan towards an idol, not the feeling that a wife should have towards her husband. Yi Mubai, after all that I've been through, I finally said to myself that I don't want the passion that you've given me. I want to start my own life again, even if you threaten me with Xiangnan. He was still frowning. Wen Yuan, I won't have any messy women after marriage. He wasn't so bad that he wouldn't mess around after marriage. Wen Yuan raised his eyes and looked at him. Tell me that you love me. Even if it was a lie, she was willing to believe it. However, Yi Mubai didn't say it. He was unwilling and disdainful to lie to a woman. He really didn't fall in love with her. He had never tried to understand her. All his love had indeed fallen on the girl named Lin Cece. Even now, he still had feelings for her. And Lin Shui, whom he had chosen before, looked a bit like Lin Cece, but he didn't have feelings for her, nor did he have any feelings for her. Wen Yuan had a child, which also made him have feelings for her, so he didn't have to think about it. He was willing to marry Wen Yuan. However, other than this, there was nothing else. He was a practical man. He didn't know if he would love her in the future, but if they got married, he would use her body a lot. The few times that afternoon made him understand why they couldn't break up in the past, and why they would always roll in a bed after breaking up. Their bodies were too compatible. She was the kind of lady who looked gentle on the surface, but when it came to bed, men couldn't control themselves. Wen Yuan had a seductive body. Even though he was very angry at her now, he still wanted her. Wen Yuan's body was seductive, but he still wanted her. Yi Mubai narrowed his eyes. Other than love, I can give you anything. But other than this, I don't want anything else. Wen Yuan said stubbornly. Yi Mubai stared at her. Wen Yuan, are you childish enough? Everything between us, including Xiangnan's birth, was initiated by you. Now you don't want to be responsible for his life, do you? Wen Yuan grabbed his hair. There's no problem with Xiangnan's personality. He's very smart. He won't ask me to accept a marriage that I don't want. You can rest assured. I can rest assured. He sneered. Well, I didn't know. I had a son. Wen Yuan, you're retreating in order to advance. What tricks do you want to play? She turned her face to the side in embarrassment and closed her eyes. I didn't. If you don't believe me, we can sign an agreement. I won't use Xiangnan to threaten you. You can marry Lin Shui. He stared at her. Wen Yuan, say it again. Chapter 37:45. After she finished speaking, he stared at her and asked her with a cold voice, I'll ask you again. Either you get married, or I'll take Yi Xiangnan away. He'll have a better future if he follows me. Wen Yuan's entire body was trembling. You can give him a future, but can you give him love? He looked into her eyes and suddenly realized a fact. Yi Bai moved closer to her face and pressed his thin lips against hers. Wen Yuan, do you hate me? Her lips were tightly pursed, and she didn't make sound. Yi Bai narrowed his eyes. Because I don't love you, so you hate me? His fingers gently caressed her face. When we first started, I said that there was only sex and no love between us. It was impossible for us to get married. But Wen Yuan, tell me, how do we get child? His hand gently touched her neck and slid down her veins, as if he could break her neck with a single force. Wen Yuan closed his eyes. This is the last time. You didn't use any protection. Why didn't you take the medicine? He stared at her with a burning gaze, not letting go of any of her expressions. Wen Yuan smiled miserably. Yi Bai, if you don't want this child, you can leave now. Really? I'll give up, okay? I won't pester you anymore. I won't seduce you anymore, and I won't appear in front of you anymore. She smiled and cried. Yi Bai, really, you can pretend that it never happened. You can still go back to America and be your director. I won't look for you again, even if I might marry Lin Shui. He looked into her eyes and said in a heavy tone, Wen Yuan, have you thought it through? Her face was covered in tears, but she still said, yes, I've thought it through. She wasn't a child anymore. Before she left, she had thought it through clearly. She wanted to start over. Xiangnan was also a very smart child. He would make her happy, and they would all make her happy. In the past, without Yi Bai, they were fine, and they would be fine in the future. Yi Bai looked at her for a long time and suddenly smiled. Wen Yuan, if you think it through, don't change your mind. Don't show up in front of me one day and tell me that you're pregnant with my child again. Damn it, you better figure out whether you have my child in your stomach now. I've taken my medicine. Her voice was a little flustered. Her eyes were filled with tears, and she felt a little humiliated. Perhaps in Wen Yuan's life, she had always been happy. She was the eldest daughter of the Wen family, and later on, she married Yi Mulan. No one had ever looked down on her. She was honorable, but in front of Yi Bai, she would always be a tiny fan. Wen Yuan was a mature woman, but in front of Yi Bai, she was always like a young girl, full of emotions. Now, everything was over. She didn't want to be that young girl anymore because she had Xiangnan. She couldn't let Xiangnan suffer for her own feelings. Yi Bai didn't love her. She didn't want Xiangnan to see his parents not loving each other. This kind of family wasn't good for Xiangnan. When the child grew up, he would understand. Wen Yuan wholeheartedly wanted him to leave, wanted him to give up, and he didn't believe her. She closed her eyes. I have ordinary cold medicine and anti-inflammatory medicine here. If you're worried, she stood up and took out a box of medicine from the small drawer. She poured out 4 or 5 pills and stuffed them in her mouth. She picked up a glass of water and drank half of it before swallowing all the medicine. Yi Bai's expression was ugly. End of this chapter. Chapter 3746. Wen Yuan's face was even worse than his, and it was also very pale. She said softly, you can rest assured now. Even if I have a child, I can't give birth to it. After saying that, the cup between her fingers fell on the coffee table, and the water splashed everywhere. However, she seemed to be unaware of it. She just looked at him and smiled faintly. It was as if she was mocking him and also mocking herself. Yi Bai just looked at her and kept looking at her. After a long time, he said, it's good that you've thought it through. He stood up and said indifferently, I will pay the child support fee, and I will also ask to visit him from time to time. He is my son, and there is no reason for you to monopolize him. Then he lowered his eyes. I will ask the lawyer to come over tomorrow, if you haven't changed your mind. Wen Yuan looked down and didn't say anything. Yi Bai stared at her for a long time. She thought he would leave, but he didn't. Instead, he took off his coat, threw it aside, and walked straight to the children's room. Wen Yuan came back to her senses and stopped him. Her face was very ugly, and she bit her lip. What do you want to do? I'll sleep with Xiangnan. Otherwise, do you think I should sleep with you, Miss Wen? His voice was also very cold, and it was a little mocking. Wen Yuan bit her lower lip. Can you sleep on the sofa? Or I'll sleep on the sofa in the master bedroom. There are no extra rooms here. She knew that if he really fought with her, she had no chance of winning. After she said that, Yi Mubai frowned. Suddenly, he came over, grabbed her body, and walked to her bedroom. Wen Yuan was scared. He took her away, closed the door, raised his hand, and took off his shirt. He took her to the soft bed. It was a little comfortable, and her breath was everywhere. He fell on the bed with her. He didn't do anything, although he had the intention. But basically, Yi Mubai was also a man with principles. He just trapped her and said in a deep voice, "If you still think it's not good to get married after this night, I will ask the lawyer to come over tomorrow morning." He had been running back and forth for a few days, and he was also tired, so he decided to sleep after saying that. He didn't even take a shower. After Wen Yuan was held in his arms, her nose was filled with his breath. In fact, she knew what he meant in her heart. He was telling her that a marriage without love and only sex was not so unbearable. However, she couldn't get over herself. She didn't want to chase after a man who didn't love her. Wen Yuan closed her eyes. She wanted to ignore this feeling, but she couldn't. She didn't want to cry, but she did. The one who was hugging her was not just a man. He was not just Xiangnan's father. He was her entire youth. She closed her eyes, turned around, and hooked her arms around his neck. Yi Mubai closed his eyes, but the corners of his mouth were slightly raised. He put his hand around her waist and leaned forward to kiss her. Wen Yuan lowered her head and didn't let him kiss her. She just buried her face in his chest and quietly felt his warmth. Yi Mubai lowered his head and looked at her. He didn't force her. He was too tired, and he fell asleep just like that. Or maybe he didn't love her. If he had coaxed her that night, if he had insisted on accompanying her, maybe they wouldn't have been separated like this. Maybe Wen Yuan wouldn't have given up. They had shared countless times, and they had a child. But in such a quiet night, they were still like strangers. She didn't feel warmth in his arms. He kissed her just now because of Yuan. Updated tomorrow at noon. Chapter 37:47. Wen Yuan stayed quiet until dawn. She didn't even close her eyes because she was afraid that if she closed her eyes, she would be vulnerable again and sink into depravity again. Just like that, it was dawn, and the morning light shone through the white curtains. Her eyes were a little sore and a little bitter. She gently blinked in his arms. Yi Mubai was still hugging her from behind. She gently struggled to get up, but when she was getting dressed, she couldn't help but turn her head to look at him. He was very good-looking. Even though he was in his 30s, he still had the most perfect appearance, and his body was well-maintained. Wen Yuan looked at him silently for a long time, then pushed the door open and went out. She made breakfast and then woke up Xiangnan. Xiangnan had already signed up for school and had to be at school before 8 o'clock. She woke her son up, took care of his clothes and food, and then sent him to kindergarten. She also asked for leave from school. After everything was done, she returned to the apartment. Yi Mubai was already up. He was wearing denim trousers, and his upper body was bare, revealing his muscular body. When he saw her come back, he frowned. "Where's Xiangnan?" Wen Yuan slowly closed the door and then looked down. "I signed him up for kindergarten. He's been at school for 2 days." She paused, as if she was afraid that he would object. "He's very obedient, and he's doing very well in school." Yi Mubai looked at her and then frowned. "Do you have any men's shirts here?" After asking, he also felt that it was a waste of time. How could she have any? Wen Yuan knew that he didn't like the smell of his shirt, so she said softly, "I'll wash it for you and dry it." When she said it, it was natural, and she didn't think much about it and went to the room. He grabbed her hand, still frowning. "What is this?" Wen Yuan stopped in his tracks and lowered his eyes. "Or I can help you buy it." "No need." His voice wasn't different, and then he let go of her. Wen Yuan went to the bedroom, took his shirt, washed it by hand, and then dried it. Yi Mubai leaned against the door of the bathroom and looked at her, watching her submissive appearance. Wen Yuan was very good-looking. His eyebrows and eyes were the type that would suit a home, especially his side profile, which was very good-looking. She was very focused when she was doing something, and he kept staring at her. After a long time, his voice was indifferent. "Wen Yuan, what's your decision?" She lowered her eyes, her long eyelashes fluttering. She turned back to glance at him before lowering her eyes again, her voice very soft. I want to live in H City. He crossed his arms in front of him and looked at her quietly. You mean, you want to take care of Xiangnan alone? Yes. She pursed her lips. I want to be alone. She spoke again. Life in America is not suitable for me. He walked in and hooked his arm around her waist from behind. His strength was a little rough. He turned her around and pinched her chin with his other hand. His eyes searched for any changes in her expression. Then why did you go to the United States before? She didn't know what to do under his grip. She licked her lips. That was then, and now is now, Yi Mu Bai. My feelings then and now are different. At that time, she still had feelings for him, but ever since that time in the hospital, she felt that it was impossible for them to be together again. She didn't want to be that humble anymore. Is that so? He narrowed his eyes. It's good that you've decided. After that, he didn't talk to her anymore. He let her go and walked to the balcony of the bedroom to smoke. This book came from Chapter 3748. Wen Yuan continued to dry his clothes. She just turned her head and glanced at his back. Sexy and tall. She didn't dare to look at him anymore and turned her head back in a panic. His proposal was actually attempting poison to her. She used to be unable to resist it. Wen Yuan silently tried to ignore the impact of his body on her, and she didn't want to think about the things they used to have. Yi Mu Bai turned around while smoking and leaned against the window to watch her. She was well-dressed, and only he knew how much her body made men want to vomit blood when she took off her clothes. His eyes swept over her. After a long time, she took out a shirt and walked towards him. Okay, you can change. Yi Mu Bai took the shirt with a cigarette in one hand and looked at her deeply. Wen Yuan habitually looked down and was about to leave when he grabbed her hand. This is the last time I'm asking you. His voice sounded a little low in the quiet space. I have a career in New York. I can't appear in front of you again and again. I have my own life, and I won't change myself for a woman. Accepting you and Xiangnan is my biggest concession. If you want me to stay in H City with you, don't even think about it. Wen Yuan gently broke away from his hand. I didn't think that way. She looked up at him bravely. I don't dare to think that you'll give up anything for me or Xiangnan. Yi Mu Bai, Xiangnan was just an accident. You don't have to take it to heart. I can sign the agreement if you want, but I don't want your money. If you don't want my money, why do you want emoluments? His gaze was a little threatening. Wen Yuan bit her lip and looked down. After a long time, she smiled. For me, he's my family, and you really, actually have nothing to do with him. She took a deep breath. It's just a dream that I pursued when I was young. When you were young, Yi Mu Bai sneered. Wen Yuan, you followed me when you were 30 and begged me to sleep with you. Have you forgotten? Her face was pale. She looked away. Don't say it anymore, why not? Is it because you can't bear to look back? He let go of her with a sneer and put on his shirt. Then he dialed a number and asked his assistant to call a lawyer. In less than an hour, the lawyer came and the agreement was magically printed. Wen Yuan and Yi Mu Bai sat on two sofas in the small study. Yi Mu Bai looked at it for a while and then gave it to Wen Yuan. Wen Yuan reached out and took it. In fact, the agreement was very simple. It wasn't as complicated as that of divorced couples. It was mainly focused on Xiangnan's custody and visitation. It was written that if she remarried, Xiangnan's custody would be given to him. If Yi Xianan stayed with him, he would pay her 20 million every year until Yi Xianan turned 18. Yi. And at. Yi got it, Yi. At one. Yi, do you want to file a lawsuit now? He stared at her. Make a big fuss. Tell people that the child is not my brother's, but that you slept with me. When Yuan's face was even worse. Her lips were trembling. After a long time, she said softly, Yi Mu Bai, you are too shameless. Update at night, this book came from. Chapter 3749. Are you shameless? He grabbed her wrist and raised it high. Who was the one who got pregnant with my child and played me like a fool? Wen Yuan, if you hadn't slept with me in the end, perhaps we wouldn't be like this now. But when you left, you still wanted to sleep with me. And then you told me that you had no feelings for me, that I was just a dream, and that there was no meaning to it. Don't you think that you are very selfish? He didn't even know what he was saying anymore. He was just angry. Later on, when Yi Mubai thought about the day and night, he realized that he was so angry because he liked Wen Yuan. He was angry because she had given up on him. Just when he fell in love with her, she had given up on him. But at this moment, he only felt that she was despicable, even speaking without thinking in front of the lawyer. Wen Yuan's face was very ugly and very pale. She sat there and stared at him blankly. It was as if she didn't know him. There was an indescribable hurt in her eyes at this moment. Wen Yuan was extremely fragile. She didn't even know why she was so disgusted by him. Everything she did was wrong, and he hated her. In his heart, she was a very, very scheming woman. Since that was the case, why did he still marry her? Wasn't it better to find someone he liked? Wen Yuan hugged herself. She wasn't a weak person, but at this moment, she was hurt by him. She hugged herself and lowered her eyes, not looking at him anymore. Then, she said softly, "Yi Mubai, I agree." After saying that, she was a little dazed. She knew that her decision was destined to be lonely for the rest of her life. Other than Xiangnan, she would have nothing. She would never have feelings or a man again. But she felt that for Xiangnan, she was willing to sign this. "Where do I sign?" Her voice was a little shaky, and she had been trying hard to control herself. The lawyer was very uncomfortable at the side. It wasn't going to be easy to earn money today. He took the document over and pointed to a place for Wen Yuan to sign. Wen Yuan didn't even look at it and quickly signed. She used a lot of force, and the strength of the pen seeped into the paper, leaving a heavy mark there. After signing, she stared at it blankly, then looked up at Yi Mubai. "I hope you won't regret it," he said to her. After he finished speaking, he walked out. Wen Yuan's calm voice came from behind him. "I won't. Is that so?" He stopped, turned his head, and gave her a mocking smile. Yi Mubai left, and so did the lawyer. Wen Yuan sat alone in the living room. The entire world was silent. She was wrong from the beginning. She wouldn't regret it, because she had to grow up and pay for her mistakes. Even if she was Wen Yuan, she was. She thought that he would go back to America or be city directly. But when she went to pick up Xiangnan from kindergarten in the afternoon, the teacher said that Xiangnan had been picked up by his father. Wen Yuan's mind was in a mess. When she picked up her phone and dialed his number, she felt weak all over. The call went through, and Yi Mubai's voice was very cold. "I'm picking up Xiangnan for lunch, and I'll send him back around 8 o'clock. He added, "Don't worry, Miss Wan. I'm very contractual." Wen Yuan held the phone and felt that his voice seemed to be coming from a very far place. When he opened his mouth, his voice was extremely hoarse. "Thank you." End of this chapter. Chapter 3750. You don't need to thank me. I'm Xiaonan's father, Yi Mubai said coldly, even if I want to give him a complete family. The phone in Wen Yuan's hand slipped. When she came back to her senses and picked it up, her face was already full of tears. She didn't know what was wrong with her. She just felt very, very uncomfortable. If there was anything in her life that she regretted the most, it would be the seduction that afternoon. She shouldn't have slept with him for the last time, just to say goodbye. She didn't understand why he would have such a big reaction to sex in the past. Was it because of Xiangnan's existence? She didn't understand. She didn't want to understand anymore. To understand a person meant that she wouldn't give up, and she really wanted to give up on him. On the other side, Yi Mubai hung up the phone. He held the steering wheel with both hands and focused on driving. Yi Xiangnan sat in the back seat and looked at him with a cautious and defensive expression. Yi Mubai thought that this child didn't look at him like this before. Xiangnan used to like him very much and always called him uncle. But now, was he unhappy because he called him father? Yi Mubai parked the car in front of a children's restaurant and took him to eat his favorite fried chicken. Although it was not nutritious, it was okay to eat it occasionally to make the child happy. After ordering, a lot of delicious food was piled up in front of Xiangnan, but Yi Xiangnan was not interested. He drank his drink and looked at Yi Mubai. "Uncle, when will you take me home?" Yi Mubai felt a pain in his heart. He reached out and rubbed the little guy's head. "Xiangnan, didn't I tell you that I'm a father, not an uncle?" He didn't expect him to understand, but Xiangnan nodded. "I know." Yi Mubai frowned. Did Mom tell you that? At home, I used to call Dad Uncle, so Uncle is Dad. The little guy was only 3 years old, but he was able to explain such a complicated relationship so clearly. Yi Mubai was stunned for a moment. Then he thought that this child was quite smart, just like Bai Anan. He had inherited the intelligence of a Yi family. He had mixed feelings. After all, he was his own child. It would be a lie to say that he did not like him. Moreover, Xiangnan was so adorable. He could not bear to part with him. But it would be too cruel for him and Wen Yuan to go to court and snatch Xiangnan away. He wanted to marry Wen Yuan for Xiangnan, but that woman did not agree. Therefore, he and Wen Yuan had no other relationship except for the fact that they shared a son. No matter how tempting her body was, there was no need for him to sleep with such a stupid woman. Yes, stupid. Yi Mubai ruffled his son's hair and said gently, "After you finish eating, Daddy will take you to buy some gifts and then send you to Mommy's place." As he spoke, his voice was a little hoarse. He leaned over and pressed his forehead against Xiangnan's. "You will still live with Mommy in the future, but if you miss Daddy, you can call me, and Daddy will appear, okay?" Xiangnan stared at him in a daze. Yi Mubai felt a little sad in his heart. He smiled gently and said, "In the future, you have to call me Daddy." He was just angry before, but now facing Xiangnan, he was even more angry at that cruel woman. For the so-called dream and self-esteem, she let Xiangnan grow up in a single-parent family. Wen Yuan was the most unreasonable woman he had ever met. He really wanted to strangle her to death. End of this chapter. Chapter 3751. Xiangnan looked at him. After a while, he lowered his head and said, "Okay," dejectedly. Then, he leaned on him again. He looked so pitiful that he couldn't even enjoy his meal. Yi Mubai reached out and touched his little head. His heart ached a little. Perhaps, at this moment, he hated Wen Yuan the most. Xiangnan didn't enjoy his meal. After a while, he looked at Yi Mubai. "Daddy, do you want to eat?" "Daddy isn't hungry." Yi Mubai's voice was indifferent. Xiangnan responded with an "oh," and became even more dejected. After a while, he handed over a drumstick. Without saying anything, he gave it to Yi Mubai. Yi Mubai looked at him, then silently took it and took a bite. Yi Xiangnan chuckled softly. At that moment, Yi Mubai loved Xiangnan very much, but he also felt a little guilty. It was an indescribable feeling. Later, he took Xiangnan to the amusement park to play for 2 hours. Then he went to buy gifts. From toys to clothes and shoes, the whole trunk was piled up. On the way, Wen Yuan called. Yi Mubai raised his hand to look at the time. It was already past 8 o'clock. He picked up the phone. "I'll send him back in a while." She didn't say anything. He couldn't help but mock her again. "Don't worry, I'm not a person who goes back on his word." He thought that she wouldn't say anything. Unexpectedly, Wen Yuan still said, "Yi Mubai, actually, there's no reason for you to hate me." "Then why do you hate me? Is there a reason?" "For start to finish, we were just a man and a woman." His voice was low and cold. It was because he missed Nan and fell asleep that he spoke to her like this. Wen Yuan was embarrassed and directly hung up the phone. Yi Mubai pursed his lips and also hung up the phone. When driving back, he looked at the rearview mirror from time to time and looked at Xiangnan. Xiangnan slept soundly. After all, he was a 3-year-old child. He was tired after playing for a whole day. The car arrived at her apartment building. Wen Yuan was waiting downstairs. He stopped the car, opened the back seat door, and carried Xiangnan to her. He took Xiangnan's gift and followed her upstairs. Wen Yuan was a little uneasy. After arriving at the apartment, she put Xiangnan down and asked softly, "You're leaving tomorrow?" Wen Yuan didn't know what to say, so he could only say, "I'll see you off." He stood there without moving. As soon as she walked away, she pressed herself against his chest, as if throwing herself into his embrace. Yi Mubai stared at her. "Miss Wen, what tricks are you playing now?" When she fell into his arms, she was so dizzy that she could not get up in time, and he thought that she had seduced him. Slowly standing up, she did not explain to herself because there was no need. He had already determined that she was seducing him. Yi Mubai stared at her for a long time before saying in a hoarse voice, "I'm leaving. There's a film to be shot." It might be 4 months after it's done. I'll call Xiangnan. She nodded lightly, not saying anything. Yi Mubai wanted to say something, but he felt that there was no need. At this moment, he also realized that she was wearing a very conservative set of home clothes, and she was very tightly wrapped up. He couldn't help but sneer. In the future, he would not sleep with her, even if she took off all her clothes. He left without any reluctance to leave. He just went to Xiangnan's room, kissed the little boy, and covered him with the quilt. Yi Mubai had never been a father, but he wasn't young anymore. He knew how to love and care for a child. Perhaps he would reject a scheming woman, but he wouldn't reject a gentle child like Xiangnan. This was his flesh and blood. He didn't need a DNA test to be sure. When Yuan stood at the door, looking at him quietly. When he looked up, his eyes met hers. After a long time, he said softly, "When Yuan, you think you're great, but in fact you're very selfish. You're very cruel to Xiangnan." With that, he walked past her, and when Yuan stood in the corridor, his whole body cold. In the end, Yi Mubai still left. On such a lonely night, when Yuan stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling window, looking into the distance. The plane took off at the airport. Did he leave? Later, she heard that he broke up with Lin Xuanyi. Later, there was a rumor that he had an affair with a Chinese star in the United States. That girl was a newcomer, the female lead of his film. After the filming of his film was completed, the photo of the girl sitting on his lap at the celebration party was published on the front page of all the major magazines. That young female star with a bright future openly said that Yi Mubai was everything she imagined a man to be. When Yuan was far away, occasionally, she would see news of him. She just watched quietly. In their world, there was no intersection except for Xiangnan. He would call once or twice a week and talk to Xiangnan for about half an hour. Since Nan Nan was talking in his room, when Mian wouldn't be there to listen, Yi Mubai never came back. It was not until the Spring Festival that when Yuan heard from Bai Shuili that Yi Mubai was coming back, and he might even bring a girlfriend back. Was it that female star, Lin Danny? When Yuan stood by the window, looking at the fine snow outside quietly, after a long time, she chuckled softly, somewhat mockingly. Her phone rang. She walked over to pick it up. It was a call from Xiangnan's teacher. He sounded very anxious. "Miss Wen, Yi Xiangnan is not feeling well. He has been sent to the hospital. Please hurry over. It's the hematology department of XX Hospital. That you're tuning in to the Romance Rendezvous YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.